Crazy Stupid Podcast.
Thank you all so much for tuning in. If this is your first time watching, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button and click the like and bell so that you are aware of when we post things.
We are reading the 2006 Civil War. It has 7 issues, and we have read the first one, and we have some thoughts. But yes, one of the reasons why we wanted to do this is because we know that the film Captain America Civil War was inspired by this, but because they did not have the X-Men or rights to the X-Men or the word
Any
mutants,
Fox characters, to be honest.
or any Fox characters, that they sort of had to alter the plot a little bit. And we were interested to see how it compares and how does the impact of the story land differently when you do have the involvement of mutants.
It's hard to tell a story about Marvel Civil War and not have the Fox characters involved in it, which is why the comics are so much better. And I understand now after reading it why so many fans were like, I wish they had X, Y, and Z, because after reading this, I'm like, it feels more personal, you know, like at the beginning, when they go in to sort of clean up after the explosion, the Sentinels are there and Wolverine looks up and he's like clearly irritated. And for us, we know what the Sentinels will eventually be, but like they just haven't gotten there yet. Mm-hmm. And so you can see how the mom responds and she's like, don't worry, they're here to protect us from the mutants. Essentially, like right. That is what she's saying.
She says they're the good guys.
Yes. Which I found interesting how she only said that about the mutants. Mm-hmm. She didn't say that about other superheroes. The comics kind of show how there is some privilege for non-mutant superheroes that mutants don't always have. Mm-hmm. Right? You even saw that later on in the comics with Johnny Storm when he goes into the club and he's getting like the VIP access and everybody else is like, wait a minute. Why does he get to cut in front of us? Like things like that. They beat his ass. Yes, no. Well, and I'll get to that later on. But though that sort of dynamic is why the X-Men are so important. Yes. Because to me, that feels like what we see a lot in our culture, where particularly in America, when we were just talking about this with like books being banned or like the issues with like protests and yada, 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 people are not actually saying the thing that they're actually afraid or angry about. And I think this comic is really showing that for a lot of people, it's not just about they have a problem with superheroes. I think their real phobia is with mutants. Like underneath it all, that's what's really driving the frustration and the bigotry a little bit more than just enhanced humans. And you saw that with the way the mom responded when Wolverine showed up, as opposed to some of the other superheroes.
I agree. I definitely think the involvement of the mutants, it makes the story a bit more consequential for a number of reasons. For the reason that you just said, is that you can see within this class of superheroes, there is like levels to how they are received by people in society at large. Yeah. I also think the important thing with mutants is that not all mutants are superheroes, because like anybody can be a mutant. Whereas when you're talking about superheroes and the Accords and, you know, the destruction of property, etc., you're talking about a very small class of people that already, for the most part, are fairly privileged in a way, especially obviously some more so than others, but like you're talking about like your Tony Starks, okay? Like,
oh, I've got so much to say about him.
Even Captain America, like these are like people that are highly regarded in American in society, right? They are looked up to because people view them as protectors, even as they are like, you guys are too destructive and you da 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 da. There's still a sense of like prestige around this group of people. Mm-hmm. I think the same is probably true for some of the X-Men too. I need to read a bit more. Probably not to the same extent though, but where they're heading, right? What they were starting to discuss was like some sort of like registry, like registration, and that would impact all mutants, which sort of makes this a problem. It takes it out of like this elite class of heroes, and it makes it a bigger problem that impacts just everyday regular people trying to live their lives.
Right.
And you see how it could be extremely oppressive. I also think the key difference is that the superheroes, that are not mutants, a lot of them chose to do this, right? Like Captain America signed up.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Thank you.
To get the
Serum.
And Tony Stark, like you built that shit. Like you're not even
you're not even enhanced.
Yeah, you're just a regular guy who chose to build a suit, right?
We'll be honest, this is an anti-Tony Stark podcast, okay? So if you think this will be anything else, please just
oh gosh,
keep scrolling.
There's obviously some of them who didn't, right? Like Hulk, that was like an accident, and like, you know, Peter Parker and stuff, right? There's exceptions. But like a lot of them did, even if they did not choose the abilities that they were given, they chose to use them to become superheroes.
Yes.
Now, the same thing is true for the X-Men. They were mutants who chose to become superheroes. But I think the thing that X-Men makes really clear in their stories and how they tell it is that a lot of times the people who become X-Men are people that Professor X sought out because they were discarded already. Mm-hmm. And they were already isolated and ostracized and without community. And so Professor X calls those people in so that they are not alone. Yeah. And in so doing, they become, and so there's like a difference between how you become an X-Men versus how a person chooses to become a superhero, which is like, oh, I've been given this ability and I believe like I have a duty to use it for good, versus like I was ostracized because I have this thing that people think makes me a freak.
Yeah.
And now I am looking for a community of people and this is who I found.
But this is where it also gets interesting because you sort of touched on that. You would essentially have to be very invasive for every single human being around the globe because there are mutant traits that are non-visible. Mm-hmm. And so you would have to test every single person to see, are you a mutant? But then there's questions of like, sometimes mutant genes are dormant. So how do you deal with that? There's conversations of when they get registered, let's say someone like Magneto or Wanda, their citizenship is not American. And so now they will essentially become weapons for any country based off of where the mutants were born. And so I feel like that's going to make it even more complicated, not just of like where America's going to want to go. If your citizenship is like for a country that is being oppressive to another country, and they tell you that we need you to be on the front line, and you sign off on that registration act, if you don't do it, you're breaking the law. You know, like it gets messier. And I don't know if some of these other characters like Tony Stark were thinking about this. And this is my problem with Tony Stark in the comics, specifically in this Civil War one. It is always just about him. He goes to the funeral, and that is the catalyst that sets him off into wanting to sign the Accords. And he doesn't think about the nuance that comes with everything these governments are asking, which is precisely why Spider-Man comes in and he says, it might be cool for you because your identity is already revealed to the world. Everybody knows who you are, but that's not how it is for my life. Not to mention, Tony, you are a multi-billionaire. You can afford, when enemies try to come for you and your loved ones, you could send Pepper Potts into a penthouse, have her locked away somewhere where it's nice and safe. You have your iron suits to protect her. That just, not every superhero or mutant has that luxury. Not everyone is a Tony Stark. Not everyone is a Captain America. Not everyone is a Reed Richards that has the social and political capital where no one would want to risk harm on people like that because as of right now, they're so beloved. Now that will probably change as it goes down the line, but they're seen as like A-list superheroes. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? But there are B-list ones, there are C-list ones that just don't have that luxury. And that's kind of always been my frustrations. Like, Tony, it cannot just be about your personal convictions. You have to start thinking larger than that. Are you considering what you might be doing to people who don't want their mutant gene to be revealed to the world? Like, you are essentially outing them. You know what I mean? And like, that's going to destroy a lot of relationships, a lot of dynamics for people that just weren't ready to do that yet. And that's always kind of my problem. I have more to say on him, but I'll get a little bit of that later on.
Yeah, I kind of want to go back to what you were saying about how invasive it would be, and like sort of all of the just sort of collateral impact of trying to do something like this. As you were talking about it, it just started to sound so much like what a lot of activists are saying now about like the trans panic that's happening, and like the ultimate impact of that. You already see it happening online. There's accounts and pages of people where all they do is look at pictures of people and like analyze to be like, look at their bone structure, look at their Adam's apple, or look at how broad their shoulders are. This person is not a woman, or this person, right? Like, that's already happening. People like saying that they're experts in like this pseudoscience, which, let me tell you something, it sounds a lot like race science. It sounds a lot like measuring skulls. Okay? That are already like, I'm experts in this, and like trying to out people. Anytime that you are supposedly trying to like single out a singular group of people based on some sort of identity marker, those things are so hard to isolate.
Yeah.
In legislation, in any sort of large scale institutional practices, that there will always be overflow. There will always be impact on other people. And that's not to say that that's why it matters. Even if the only people impacted by this were trans people and it didn't impact anybody else, it would still be absolutely horrendous. But it's just another reason why people should be thinking about what you say and what you are, the ideas that you're contributing to, because it's not just going to impact you, because you can't isolate these things. It's the same thing with abortion. You think that you're isolating out abortion, but you can't. No. In practice, you can't do that. In legislation, it's very difficult.
It sets precedent
to do that. It sets precedent, and also language itself. Our laws are really dependent on language, right? It's literally how these words are written on the page, how they are and how they can be interpreted. And language itself makes it very difficult to isolate out certain things, right? You have an idea in your mind of what an abortion is, but there is a definition of the word. When you put down on paper that the aborting of a pregnancy is illegal, there are lots of different scenarios that are now included in that, because language is just limiting like that. So like with all of these things, there's just always going to be, it's always going to be bigger than you think it's going to be. And that's why, that's not the reason why, but that is one reason why you always aim to cast the largest net of protection. You want as many people to be protected as possible, because when you are protecting the most marginalized people in society, everybody else who has like less marginalized identities is going to be included in that net of protection as well. But when you isolate them, you think you're only isolating them, and you're not. There's always going to leak.
The difference between mutants and the Avengers shows up often, but I think the biggest contributor, and you sort of touched on this earlier, the biggest contributor is that a lot of the Avengers, they signed off on this, and they can choose to hang up their boots, hang up their cleats, and no one would like ever know, except for like the famous ones, obviously. The issue that I have with Tony being so loud about the Registration Act is that there's nothing about Tony's genes that is prohibiting him from living a normal life if he were to not be a hero. That isn't the case for X-Men and mutants. Even if you were to sign the Registration Act, Tony, you have to know what the precedent is. The issue is that countries have a problem with mutants. This is just the long game for how they get to where they want to get. We see it in real life. We saw how things were started out like 2 years ago with just a talk of critical race theories or removing certain conversations about queer people in classrooms. And we've seen how it has continued to escalate. We're now like, you can't even have certain Martin Luther King books in classrooms without it being banned. The escalation is something that you should be intelligent enough, Tony, to see. And the issue is like, even if you were to ban superheroes, the issue that is underlining the bigotry amongst a lot of citizens is still going to be there, because even a non-superhero mutant is still going to be seen as a problem for society. And you know what's going to happen next, because there's going to be mutants that might do something that is seen as illegal, or one individual mutant that breaks the law. And now the Registration Act against superheroes gets used as a precedent to be combative against all mutants, because they just want to eliminate anything that is perceived as a threat to them in general. And it just feels so tone deaf for the person who seems to be the loudest, that is for the Registration Act, is someone that will never have to worry about any of the possible scenarios that this precedent might have on everyone. I'm just going to come out and say, I don't think he's a hero. I think he's a rich guy who has convictions about individual morality. That's just not how the world works. When you have social identities, it's not just about individual morality. There are larger things that are going to always be at play, things that are going to always be at work. And this is another thing that I thought about, particularly with Tony. You've got all this noise about superheroes and the Registration Act. A lot of it is like the destruction that comes from like trying to deal with like street level crime, right? But to be honest, though, there is no need for these in these comic book stories. There isn't any need for street level crime to even exist. When you have multi-billion-dollar people like Tony Stark, who chose to use all of that wealth and power and resource to build a machine to fight individual crime, as opposed to dealing with the real core issues that create symptoms like individual crime. And so you got Tony, you got Reed Richards, that at this point in the comics are the loudest ones that are pro-registration. You cannot tell me that the two most brilliant people in that country at that time could not find a better use of your powers, of your intelligence, of your mind to solve greater problems than just do things of like fighting bad guys. You're not being the hero that you think you are in the long run. And yes, that could be said about all superheroes, but Steve Rogers doesn't have the mind or the money of Tony Stark. Yeah, Spider-Man is super intelligent, but he doesn't have the wealth that like T'Challa and Shuri have. And I feel like, it's just, the legacy for heroes, particularly with those two, it just does not land the same for me. Cause I'm like, bro, you get all this money and you just made a suit to beat up people. Like, it sounds like you need to go to therapy and then just use your money more equitably. Like, I don't know. Like, it's just, I don't like him the more I read about his idea.
The thing is, I think, and you did kind of touch on this, I do think it is heightened with Tony Stark. I also do think, though, that this is sort of just like a fundamental issue with the comic book superhero genre writ large. Because the idea is you create a more just and safe society by fighting crime. That is essentially the through line through all of these stories. Mm-hmm. And we know in reality that that's not true. But that's why a lot of times these comic books and movies are criticized as being like pro-military propaganda, pro-cop propaganda.
Yeah.
Because it is like at its core, that is like the fundamental concept of like pretty much any superhero story, is that like you're creating a better world by stopping the bad guys. We can see them as people who have had bad things happen to them that cause them to do bad things.
Right.
And if we treat the underlying problem, that's what creates a safer society for the people around them.
You doing what you're doing and trying to fight things on an individual level is always going to be met with a response of an individual trying to challenge you. That's just the philosophy of how you are using your talents. You're not going at a larger scale. It's just like we've had cops who left the police force after working throughout the 80s and the 90s because they're like, we're not solving anything. The war on drugs is not solving anything. We're not doing anything to make anything safer. It's not contributing to anything proactive. It's not contributing to anything long lasting and durable. And so when Steve said that, I was just like, bro, I just think you're a little out of touch with how impactful you are. It can't just be about inspiring individuals. It has to be something larger than that. And history kind of proves that like legislation has to come first and then hearts are going to change afterwards. Like Loving versus Virginia was unpopular when SCOTUS makes that decision. And then as years went on, people realized it wasn't that bad of a thing, right? So you can't always go, let's inspire the individuals first. And then once we have enough, we can then, put things more concrete. History just has never worked that way.
Yeah, people have to live in the reality to know that it's not something to be afraid
Exactly.
of. Yeah. I think the thing is like, it's like not all of their powers lend themselves to that sort of justice. Mm-hmm. It's like Tony Stark, like you were saying, like Tony Stark, the entire country of Wakanda, like, yeah, like there's a lot more that you could be doing. I think someone like Captain America, who was like literally created to be like a weapon of war, like that's why you exist.
Yeah.
Is to like, and I mean, it's not to say that there's no place for that. Like, obviously, you need people that can step in when things get to that point, right?
Yeah.
Like, this is the same conversation that comes up all the time when people talk about, like, abolishing the police. Is the question always comes up of, like, okay, but, like, what about all the people that are committing crimes not because of societal problems? Which is, like, true. Like, they exist. Mm-hmm. Like, there are people that just do bad things to do bad things. Mm-hmm. And I do believe that you need something. You need some sort of system available to respond. I actually think like reading this is making me think of a couple different limitations of the genre, I think. I think like in a number of ways, the comic version of the story adds more weight to the story. And like we said, makes it seem more consequential. I also think it makes it a little bit more problematic because as I'm reading, there's me as the reader, right? Being like, this is a bad idea and it would harm a lot of people. And then also there's me that's like, but if I was like a human being living in this world,
right?
Here's the thing. Anywhere around you, there could be a person that has a superhuman ability that could harm you.
Could literally destroy the building right next to you.
And you have no way of knowing who those people are, where they are, if they're a good person, if they're a bad person, so the feeling of fear in the comic books is very justified. And that's what makes it a little bit awkward, because it's meant, I think, to be an allegory for oppression in real life, in which the fear is absolutely not justified, right? Like, there's no reason for you to be afraid of Black people. There's no reason for you to be afraid of trans people. There's no reason for you to be afraid of any of these people with marginalized identities in real life, because they're just regular humans just like you. And your fear is based on hatred, right? In the comics, though, it's kind of like, well, actually, this group of people is inherently more dangerous
than your average human.
Yeah, because they have the ability to do things that other people cannot do.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, and this is, I'm realizing now that this is the problem in a lot of these allegories. And I think what happens is that in the minds of some of the people trying to write it, like this happened in Zootopia, this happened in Attack on Titan, right? It's the same thing. I think what happens is in the minds of the people writing it, I think sometimes they want to reach a certain audience. They're trying to speak to the people who hold these prejudices.
Right.
And I think they over-identify with them sometimes. And so they try to, it's like they're taking on their point of view of legitimizing these fears and then being like, but you see, these are good people. So you don't need to be afraid of them, even though they, whatever. But like, you've done you've legitimized it.
Right.
And so now the entire point that you're trying to make is so much weaker because you've made it so that like.
I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
They'll walk away instead of seeing this entire demographic as safe and as normal and as your equal. They'll walk away in the back of their mind thinking the best way is for me to then say, I have to pick and choose.
Yeah, like these are the good ones.
These are the good ones. These are the bad ones. But that isn't how you approach that in real life.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it does in that way, I think it's just like, there's just not a really, with the way that the story has already been written, right? Like we can't go back now, like this out. It is. There's not a really great workaround for that.
Yeah.
I do think Fullmetal, now that I'm watching it, did find a very good workaround.
See, this is what I'm saying.
Yes.
I'm excited for you to finish watching it because at some point we'll have to talk about comics and anime and shows that are able to do that message better, because I used to think that as time goes on, we'll learn how to do it better. But that Fullmetal came out in the early 2000s.
Yeah, it's almost 20 years
old. You know
what
I
right?
mean? Yeah, and we've seen other people talk about this, how like if you want people to walk away and apply this allegory in their real everyday experience, you can't make the group that the metaphor is based off of just inherently violent. Like if you
more dangerous.
Yeah, like if you wanted the Eldians to represent Jewish people, you can't give them the power to destroy the world. I can't. It doesn't land as well, and it feels like this is what I'll say. The problem is that you won't walk away seeing your privilege. You'll walk away both sides in the situation, and that I think has kind of been the problem with how people leave these stories.
Yeah, I agree.
It gives them what's the word? Like it gives them like kind of like the escape of not having to self-reflect and admit that I may have privilege in the way that I'm interacting with these groups of people, because once you make them inherently dangerous, you're not going to see that as privilege. You're going to see that as on an individual basis. You do bad things, I do bad things, and we just have to be good people as individuals. But that's just not how the real world works.
Yeah. I think there's two things that come to mind that did a really good job: Fullmetal and Lovecraft Country.
Yes.
And I think that what they did that was very different is obviously, like, these are supposed to be fantastical stories, sci-fi stories. Like, there's gonna be like some outside of reality elements to the story, right? People having special abilities, etc. What they did was, though, they said this exists in this world, and any person has access to it.
Yeah.
Right? Like, anybody can learn. I think
alchemy.
Anybody can learn alchemy. You just have to like learn how to do it. And like in Lovecraft, it's like, well, actually, at first, only white people have magic, and then black people. But it's like everybody can gain access to this thing. But in order to make this a story about systems of oppression, they're also centering like, I mean, I'm realizing, obviously I'm still like, I'm only halfway through Fullmetal, but as the story goes on, what I'm realizing is that what happened in the Ishvalan War, right, is in some way like a, I want to say like Nexus event. It's like a central core part of everything else that is happening, right? So it's not like you're just throwing it in the background as like and also this is going on.
Yeah.
It's like, no, this is like undergirding everything that's happening. It's defining all these other layers above it. So while you're like, oh, alchemy and, you know, the Elric brothers and there's all these other things, there's this underlying thing that is informing all of it. Like what happened here and why it happened and all the different players and people involved is informing all the layers above the story. And as it goes further and further, you see more and more about why. And I think that's like a great way to do this, because you're not using it, because I think some people like sort of exploit oppression in their stories as like we'll throw this in so that it feels a little bit more deep, right?
Yeah.
They're not doing that. It matters a lot to the story, but they're not legitimizing prejudicial beliefs, right?
Because in Attack on Titan, right now in history, aliens are being oppressed, but that isn't the catalyst,
right?
Because for a lot of the other people around the world, the catalyst is, well, for centuries you all were the oppressors. It's just a matter of like anyone at any point could be an oppressor, which in theory is true. That just is not how history played out, though.
Yeah.
That's not how you can tell the story accurately.
I think Attack on Titan, I think there's two things that I think they could have done to make this just way less messy. I think the first thing is don't make the parallels to Jewish people so explicit. I just think you didn't have to do that. It can just be like a generic group of people, of oppressed people, you know, like I feel like the Ishvalans in Fullmetal, it's like this can be different people, right, throughout history. Like this can represent different groups of people throughout time.
Yeah.
Like one, I just think that just wasn't necessarily necessary. I think also too, if the Titan ability was like not specific to them, I think that would help things out a lot. Because here's the thing, I think that there is validity to telling a story where it's like there is this like cycle of conflict between these two groups of people that goes back. I think there's like a validity in that of like, how long can you really hold somebody accountable? Because that was the thing, like watching it for me is like, yeah, so several hundred years ago, the Eldians were oppressive to you guys, but like, how long is it like actually valid for you guys to, you know what I mean?
Especially now that power dynamics have completely
shifted, right? Like, I think that that's an interesting conversation of like, how do these conflicts, how do you navigate them? How can they be navigated? But you have to take out, I think, some of those elements to make it just less anti-Semitic.
And to be honest, I don't think the writer thought that far ahead. But the other thing that I thought was interesting, yes, I'm going to apply real life application to the consequences of the Registration Act. When it comes to the Registration Act in this comic book story, the first thing that I thought of is like, how is race going to show up when it comes to this? Yes, I know maybe I should have done that. I don't care. But like, to be quite honest, I don't want registered superheroes like policing a black neighborhood. Like I just feel like there's going to be something bad that's going to happen, and it'll feel very much like what happens with police in black neighborhoods. You're going to have some inexperienced superhero that comes in that does something drastically violent, and what they are capable of doing is probably going to be a lot more destructive than a bullet. You know what I mean? And this, I'm just saying, like, part of my concern with Tony in this story, as I mentioned earlier, is that he is only thinking about himself. Like, are there some people that are like, yo, we need superheroes to be put in check? Yes, Tony, you're going to sign off on that. But you as a superhero, you are not going to have a say in the nuance. You're not going to have a say in the details on how that gets done. And if history has proven us anything, the way countries would use that is going to be in a benefit for themselves, to use that as a way to oppress certain groups, certain countries. And I just think it cannot just be about making yourself feel better about the things you allowed yourself to do. It's bigger than you now. And I just feel like he didn't see that. We've seen things happen around the world, right? Imagine if they did the Registration Act with Nazi Germany still at its height. What would they have done with mutants? And well, we saw it, what they experimented on Magneto. But you know what I mean? Like, I just think he was not thinking about like the real world politics, the politics in your own country in America, and the history that we know exists. Because if Steve's fighting Nazis, then that means racism exists in these comic book stories. And if racism exists in these comic book stories, bro, what you're doing is just it's not giving what I think it is. I don't know if he's just not thinking ahead, or if he's just a rich white guy that does not have the capability of thinking larger out of than himself, to be honest. I just think that's what it is. Any thoughts on your end?
About this now?
All right. It sounds like you want to get into some other stuff.
Yes. I just saw a TikTok today from a teacher in Arkansas who said that on Friday, the State Board of Education, the Department of Education, decided that they were going to make it so that AP African American Studies no longer had any credit weight. So you can still offer it, but basically it counts for nothing to your graduation credits. So you can't take it as a history credit. You can't even really take it as an elective because it gives you 0 credit. It's Jesus. Like what he said is like, it's basically like it's a free period and you just happen to be taking African American studies. Like it gives you nothing, right? They did this on Friday. School started yesterday.
Yeah.
So they did it over the weekend. They refused to answer any emails, phone calls, or texts about it over the weekend. So now school has begun. Teachers who teach this course are like, huh? And students are going to come in and be like, wait, what's going on? And honestly, my very first thought when I saw this was not my first, because there's lots of other thoughts actually. But one of the things that first came to mind was, Black conservatives, what do y'all have to say about this?
Mm-hmm.
Like very genuinely, I honestly wish I could just if we post this and just tag some of these people, that'd be just on TikTok all day.
Chucking and jiving.
Yo, tap dancing, okay? Just really, they just exist to just reiterate right-wing talking points and to justify a lot of racist shit. I really want to know, what is your explanation for this? How do you explain this? How do you legitimize decisions like this?
Right.
I'm just very curious. Clarence Thomas, what do you have to say? Because I can't, even if I put on my conservative person thinking hat, and I'm thinking like a conservative, okay? There's just no reason. There is just no reason for this, right? You can come up with things of when it's elementary school kids and it's oh, well, we don't want children learning about sex and gender and da-da-da. I disagree with that, but I can put on my conservative thinking hat and say, if I had this worldview, I can sort of see how you would come to this conclusion,
right? Because
you have all these other things. But this, I just can't think. I'm just this is just very blatantly your attempt to, it's an attempt at erasure. It's just so blatantly obvious. And
right.
You can't put this under the guise of protecting children.
Right.
You can't put this under anything else. And I really would love to hear from them. It's very frustrating. It's very scary because it's already happening. Mm-hmm. It's not like we're in the prevention stage now. It's actively being put into practice. And I know that there's people on the ground who are still going to find ways around this and who are going to do what they can, etc. But like the harder that they make it, the less people will be willing and able to put in that work.
Right.
And they're going to keep making it more difficult. Like, I mean, at a certain point, if you're like, well, if you talk about the Holocaust, you also have to talk about the other side, then people are just going to be like, let's not talk about the Holocaust then, because I don't want to espouse pro-Nazi views.
Exactly.
Like, they know that. They're just going to start taking shit out.
Yeah. Not to end us on that gloomy note, but it is important for us to talk about because it's happening. And I feel like if you are not just politically involved, but like socially involved right now is the best time to do it. Any other thoughts?
No, I don't think so.
But all right, with that, we will see you all next time. Peace.